Hello, I'm Bob from Bob's Workshop. This is my replica of an MG-34. It's a machine gun that the Germans had during the Second World War. This part here is made of wood, and the barrel here is made of PVC and electrical conduit. I made this a few summers ago, and it took a long time, so I split it into 4 episodes. And then I added a 5th episode where I created a pretty cool wall bracket for this to be displayed upon. Today, I'd like to show you all of those episodes in one longer format video from start to finish. I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and I hope you like seeing how it was made. Here it is.
According to Ian McCollum and his popular YouTube channel called Forgotten Weapons, Germany's MG-34 was the world's first universal machine gun. Not only used by infantry, it could also be found in nearly all Panzers and Luftwaffe aircraft as well. An authentic MG-34 would cost over $20,000. And full-size non-functioning metal replicas are still over $500. So a few months ago, I started wondering if I could possibly make one of my own. It took a while to find a profile that could be used to make measurements for my project. I ended up using Pages on my MacBook to scale the drawing to real-life dimensions, and then printed and taped the sheets together. Since I'm doing this with an eye towards low cost, I'll begin by going through my garage and seeing what's available. I'll start with a few pieces of Poplar, which is a really nice hardwood with pretty tight grain patterns and no knots. The receiver will be glued together from 3 pieces that are each 3/4 of an inch thick. Thinking ahead, I'll remove a small area from each of the sides just in case I want to add a recoil spring and charging handle in the future. A lot of what you see now will be trimmed away later. The final measurements of this part will be something like 20 inches by 2 1/4 and 2 1/4 inches. The glue and clamps will do most of the work holding this together. The nails are just additional help for alignment until it all dries. And also the nails are in areas that will be removed anyway, and not in the finished piece. The barrel for my MG-34 will be a piece of 3/4 inch electrical conduit. I made a snug fitting channel to keep it centered along the main axis of the wooden receiver. It's now day 2. The glue has dried, so I can get it just a little bit closer to the final shape. It's oversized right now, but with my table saw, I can trim it down to the dimensions I mentioned earlier. I also used the table saw to form grooves and notched areas to help make it look less like a lump of wood and more like a machined piece of steel. The trigger assembly and pistol grip are in this shot, even though I haven't shown how it was made yet. I'll come back to that later, but it's here so I can fit some of the smaller detailed pieces. The receiver's lid is supposed to be a stamped piece of steel, but since I'm using Poplar, I'll cut out this small oval and glue another strip of wood behind it before gluing the sides and the bottom parts all together. The sides of the lid are left a little oversized and will be trimmed to their final dimensions on my table saw after they've dried. bit of trimming with a sharp knife, followed by sanding, leaves me with a wooden top for the receiver. The lid is hinged just in front of the feed tray, and this little part will be glued to the receiver before being drilled and completed with the addition of a screw on each side. After a lot of sanding with 220 grit sandpaper, I began painting the parts with Rust-Oleum flat black spray paint. Many of the details I added seemed to get lost in the dark color. So after some wet sanding to smooth out the raised grain patterns from the first coat, I decided to switch to a lighter metallic color. Before I sprayed the new color, I used a little of Tamiya's modeling putty to smooth out a few imperfections. Once the bronze paint was dry, I moved on to weathering. A thin black wash to the inner corners and recessed areas, followed by a steelish silver color to points that stick out and might get nicked in real-world situations. Wait a second, where did those cool rivets come from on the receiver's lid, you might ask? Well, they're just simple upholstery tacks that happen to look awesome when you're trying to create the illusion of stamped steel. My expenses so far have been pretty low. Less than $10 in fact. $6 for the bronze spray paint, and maybe $3 for the little screws that I've used. The wood, the electrical conduit for the barrel, the black paint, the glue, and sandpaper were all things I already had. So I'm on track for another low-budget success story. The trigger group and barrel assembly will each have their own videos, which will come out very soon. The receiver was the most complicated part that I've made so far, and I'm pretty happy with it. Today, I'd like to show you how I made the trigger assembly and pistol grip also from wood. Even in its own time, the MG-34 was an expensive gun to manufacture because so much was made from machined blocks of solid steel. A 1:1 scale drawing will allow me to transfer the basic shape to a piece of poplar before I cut it out with my scroll saw. I didn't cut exactly on the outline because it's easier to remove material than to add it back. What followed was a lot of sanding to get these curves into just the right shape, and I used double-sided tape to attach a copy of the trigger assembly to the wood, which ensured proper spacing of the pistol grips. Four mounting holes were drilled before being countersunk to accept oval-headed slotted screws, and then of course more sanding, which leads to one of my favorite parts, staining and polyurethane. Oh, that looks nice. I applied several coats of satin polyurethane over the next day, and then the grips are ready to be test fitted on the handle. Lining them up now and pre-drilling the holes allows the screws to be tightened without splitting the wood. Wooden dowel rods are expensive, but foam brushes are not. And after a little bit of cutting, I've got the ingredients for both a safety and a selector switch. The two pieces fit snugly together, which is a good thing, and now I can attach some of the smaller details that I just made. Up close, this isn't going to fool anybody, but from 15 feet away or on camera, it should be pretty convincing. I've taken a few liberties with my interpretation of this gun, and I'm just trying to capture the feeling or impression of a German MG-34. Like the receiver, this started off in flat black, which I wasn't too happy with. So after a little wet sanding, I resprayed it in a color called oil rubbed bronze. Ooh, fancy. My next step was to coat everything in black acrylic craft paint, most of which was wiped off, but some settled in the recessed areas. There was also a bit of wet sanding involved to further dull any remaining shine. And now I can add some silver highlights and nicks for that lived-in look, or as the cool kids say nowadays, patina. A real MG-34 would most likely have had pistol grips made of Bakelite, but I'm a sucker for the natural grains of stained wood sealed with polyurethane. I was even thinking, at one point, of staining this entire gun rather than painting over the natural wood. But I'm glad I painted it. I really like the more realistic look of a well-used, even beaten up, nearly 90-year-old war relic. When this whole thing is finished, it's going to be pretty heavy, especially after I install the barrel assembly. The pistol grip needs to be securely attached to the receiver. I'm drilling 2 holes that will accept wood screws and fender washers to pull the 2 parts together. A 3rd screw towards the front into the bottom of the receiver should also help, but the main strength will come from the 2 screws inside. Here's the finished receiver and fire control group back together, along with a sneak peek at the barrel, which I'll show you how to make in the next video. I've been scrounging around my garage and basement looking for items that can pass for parts of an MG-34. So far, I've used wood to make the main body of the gun. Now I need to work on the barrel, which is one of the most recognizable elements of a Maschinengewehr 34 MG-34. When people do home repairs, sometimes they have supplies left over, which eventually end up at the curb or in a dumpster, which is where I come in. This length of 1.5-inch PVC and the lumber I've used so far were all picked from the garbage. So there are a few things I needed to buy, such as paint, screws, and a few of these PVC couplings. This is called a repair coupling, so it lacks the center dividing ring, and it can slide all the way down over the pipe, so it's perfect for consistent measurements. My first row of cooling holes begin with a small pilot drill, followed by a larger spade drill. A 1/2 inch was close, but I eventually moved up to 5/8 of an inch, which is a more accurate match to the real thing. Uniformity will be key to creating the illusion here, so I need to work out a little math. The outside diameter of the pipe is 1 7/8 inches, which when converted to decimal equals 1.875 inches. That times pi equals 5.89 inches, which gives me the circumference of the pipe. And I think I'd like to have 6 rows of cooling holes, so 5.89 inches divided by 6 equals 0.981 inches, which is awfully darn close to 1 inch. I laid out my painter's tape and used a ruler to make a mark every inch, and it worked out even better than I had hoped. The last mark falls exactly on top of the first. Thanks, Mrs. Hurley and Mrs. Wanstroth, two very skilled 5th and 6th grade math teachers that I've had the pleasure to know. Clamping a yardstick at each end also helps to keep my rows nice and straight. Now it's just a lot more drilling and sanding. It's tedious, but ultimately very rewarding because by some miracle, I didn't make any mistakes measuring, and it turned out beautifully. The PVC couplings served admirably in the first part. Now they get to help again. The barrel shroud has a few ringed areas along its length, and I'll trim the couplings for this new purpose. You probably can't tell, but I also sprayed the inside of the barrel shroud through each of the cooling holes. The paint ran quite a bit. I wiped off most of it on the outside, and runs on the inside of the barrel shroud won't be visible anyway, especially with flat black spray paint. I used my scroll saw and orbital sander to create these plugs from a sheet of 3/4-inch PVC. I needed a way to keep the electrical conduits centered within the PVC pipe. Once these are set, I'll drill a hole at each end for the metal conduit / barrel to slide through.
Pour plaisir, ils ont les combats. Le cirque est plein ce jour de fête. Le cirque est plein du haut en bas. Le spectateur est dans la tête. Le spectateur s'interpelle après fracas. Apostrophe, puis c'est tapage pour rester jusqu'à ce l'empereur, car c'est la fête du courage, c'est la fête des gens de guerre. Allons, en garde, allons, allons,
These little connector pieces have sure come in handy. This one was also trimmed to size at my table saw, along with this octagon that has now been cemented to a PVC end cap. The shape of the muzzle's end was a little harder to figure out, but I found a set of these little cups at Walmart, and they're just about right. PVC cement wouldn't hold it, but gel superglue did the job.
Tout d'un coup, on fait silence, à quoi se passe-t-il? Plus d'écrit célestin, le taureau se lance en bandissant auditorie. Il s'élance, il entrefrappe, en chevelure, entraînant un pic d'or. Ah, bravo taureau, il le foule, le taureau va, il vient, et frappe encore, en secouant ses banderilles, plein de fureur il coule, le cirque est plein de sang.
The conduit barrel is now snugly inside the PVC shroud, which has been painted flat black, but it looks too new, so I'll use a little bottle of silver model paint to add some chips and nicks.
Plein de fureur il coule, le cirque est plein de sang. En ses sauts, on franchit le cri, c'est un temps maintenant. Allons, en garde, allons, allons, toréador, en garde, toréador, toréador. Et songe bien, oui, songe combattant, que le noir te regarde, et que l'amour t'attend, toréador. L'amour t'attend, toréador, toréador. L'amour t'attend.
The electrical conduit goes all the way through the receiver and out the back. I haven't made it yet, but I plan to carve out a shoulder stock from Poplar and also stain and finish it to match the wooden pistol grips. That might be part 4. The shoulder stock will have a hole drilled along its center axis so that it can slide right onto the metal conduit sticking out. So far, I've spent less than $20 on this project, but I'm about to blow the budget. What good is a belt-fed machine gun without a strip of cartridges hanging from the side? 8mm Mauser is pretty hard to find, but apparently it's common in some circles to wear dummy rounds of 7.62 NATO as a belt on your waist or bracelets on your wrist. With shipping and sales tax, I paid $35 for 21 dummy bullets held together with clips designed for an American M60 machine gun. I ended up using only 14, but it's always nice to have a few extra. So there will be at least one more segment in this series when I make the wooden shoulder stock. But MG-34s were used like this one without the shoulder stock when mounted inside tanks or in the nose of an HE-111 or the rear-facing gun on a Stuka dive bomber. One of my long-term projects this summer has been this wooden replica of a World War II German MG-34. It's not 100% accurate, probably not even 70% accurate, but I think it succeeds in giving the overall impression of a universal machine gun from the 1930s. So far, I've made the receiver, trigger assembly, and the barrel. I've added a strip of dummy bullets, and from a distance, it's looking pretty good. There are other details like the sights and the folding bipod up front that I still need to make, but in this fourth part of the MG-34 story, I'll be making the shoulder stock. The material I've used so far has been Poplar. It's a really nice hardwood that cuts well and holds detail way better than a softer wood like pine. I glued and clamped 3 sections of 3/4-inch board to get the right thickness that would match the rear of the receiver. Working with pine would have made sanding a whole lot easier, and pine is also a lot cheaper than poplar. Well, that's normally true, unless you happen to stumble upon a bunch of poplar while dumpster diving at a construction site. Free beats cheap almost every time. Most of the material was removed with a 60 grit sanding disc, but as I was getting closer to the final shape, I switched to 150. The seams between the glued boards were actually a big help in keeping the shoulder stock symmetrical. Gunstock is one of my favorite colors from Minwax, and usually stays dark like you see here. But because poplar is a harder wood, less of the color seems to be drawn into the grain. So a second coat of a darker stain, red oak, was applied, but still didn't really darken the wood as much as I would have liked. But it's close enough. Staining and finishing might be my favorite part of any project involving wood. It takes a while for each step to dry, and wet sanding between brushed coats of polyurethane followed by a final coat of spray will give the whole shoulder stock a smooth, buttery finish. The shoulder stock will slide over the 3/4 inch electrical conduit that sticks out from the back of the gun. I originally wanted the stock to be removable, like the real thing, but ultimately decided against it. The back of the receiver and the end of this piece will be left unpainted, so that I can use wood glue to permanently attach them. Pushing the two parts together and then pulling them apart for a minute or two allows me to make sure that the glue is spread evenly and also gives the glue a chance to set up just a little bit before being pushed back together and then clamped until dry. Why did I make it? Well, I like World War II, and I also like working with wood. I had a goofy notion to use it as a prop in a video, and also secretly hoped to be invited to participate with a war reenactment group. Those two things probably won't happen, which leaves option number 3, the MG-34 as wall art, or as a sort of display from a war museum. This frame was originally much larger and more square, about 3 feet by 4, but I cut it down to better complement the proportions of the MG-34. My miter saw allowed me to cut the 45-degree corners, and then I re-glued the pieces back together. Just like most of the material used to make the fake gun, this frame was also found curbside on garbage night. The silvery metallic finish is not the look I want, so I'll use 220 grit sandpaper to smooth over the corners, blend in any nicks or blemishes, but mainly the sanding is to help the new satin black paint to adhere to the old surface. Rubbing alcohol cleans away any dust, dirt, or grease, and then it's time for the new color. Check out this perfectly good piece of plywood that someone threw out. At least one side was good. Decent enough to be sanded, stained, and polyurethaned. 3 times, in fact. Yes, that's right. Multiple coats of a satin polyurethane that's allowed to dry, and then wet sanded before each subsequent coat. That way, I'll have a nice, smooth surface for what comes later. I started off with 400 grit wet sandpaper, and as I get closer to the final coat of polyurethane, I use progressively finer papers. I really love wet sanding. There's no airborne dust, the sandpaper itself lasts a really long time, and the end result is so buttery smooth. What's not to like? A black frame around a nice looking piece of stained and finished board would have looked pretty cool, but why stop there? In my mind, I was thinking of wooden packing crates. You know, the kind you might find around ships or loading docks or Indiana Jones movies. Something maybe with a spray-painted stencil across the sides. I like this eagle, especially the way that some of the black spray paint has gotten behind the stencil for sort of a fuzzy or less defined look. But I'm not finished. The Knight's Cross was an award given out by Germany, and I really like the colors used with the ribbon. I'll mimic the ribbon's pattern with 3 stripes on a diagonal towards one corner. Each one will be lightly sprayed so that wet sanding might reveal just a little of the stained wood beneath. With the surface still wet from sanding, I'll add a layer of black acrylic craft paint, most of which will be wiped off, but just enough should be left behind for the appearance of something worn and aged. Time to join the two pieces together, and 8 short drywall screws should do the job. I made sure that the screw's length was just enough to hold the plywood without coming through the nice part of the frame's face. I still need 2 brackets that will support the gun as it hangs proudly on my wall, so it's back outside to the table saw. A little bit of stain soaking in, and then some wiping to remove the excess, followed by polyurethane, wet sanding, another coat of polyurethane, more wet sanding, and then the black acrylic craft paint for the decades-old, time-weathered appearance. I masked off the areas where I want to mount the brackets, which also allows me to pre-drill holes for more drywall screws. You can't tell, but I also lined up the brackets while they were in place and pre-drilled them as well, so that the screws would not split the poplar hardwood. No need to show it here, but I used a stud finder to locate the 2x4s behind the drywall, measured and drilled holes in the plywood, and then attached the entire display using a couple of 3-inch drywall screws. That's pretty much it for the MG-34. There could still be one more video if I decide to make the front and rear sights, plus a folding bipod. But for now, I'm pretty happy with how it looks. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this has been Bob's Workshop. Take care.